This is a story about a table, and some friends, but mostly the table. My friend Jamie asked me if I could make her a live edge dining table, and I thought it sounded like a fun project. I've had these 2 slabs of cherry for a couple of years and thought this would be the perfect use for them. I just forgot how heavy they were. One of the pieces had a pretty severe cup to it, so I used my scrub plane to flatten it out a bit so it would be more stable on the bench once I flipped it over. One of the challenges with live edge slabs is there's no straight edge to reference off of. I wanted to cut some weight off the end to make them easier to handle, but I didn't want to cut them too short or crooked, so I snapped some chalk lines about where I thought I'd be ripping an edge after I flattened them and squared off with those. Once I was ready to start the flattening process, my buddy Josh Price from the PI Workshop and Making Geeks podcast had just pulled into town and said he'd give me a hand. I always love having other people in the shop, another brother in sawdust, or sister in sawdust. We talked about life, work, travel, then we got to work. We were using a router sled and rails to make passes over the slabs with a surfacing bit. Problem was, that cup I talked about was sticking up past the rails and interfering with the sled. Once we took off enough material, I started the flattening process. Contact. Gotta plug it in. After taking a break, I came back and my router wouldn't turn on for real this time. I checked the breaker, tested other tools, tried different plugs. Nothing. Some people mentioned the problem with the router could be the brushes, so I ordered some replacements. And while those are on order, luckily I have a pretty healthy Craigslist addiction, and I had picked up a spare router for pretty cheap. I don't like this router as much due to the pistol grip and trigger. I don't find it as comfortable, but it had to do. After a ton of flattening, and I mean a ton, and making a huge mess, I had 2 flat sides. I ended up removing almost an inch of material to get both flat. It took a while, and since I'm a benevolent YouTuber, I'm sparing you from the tedium. After I reclaimed my shop, it was time to start the book matching process. Now, when someone refers to a book match, they're talking about joining 2 boards that were cut sequentially when the log was milled. The end result are 2 pieces that are mirror images of each other. It's a pretty cool effect. I snapped some chalk lines, then used my poor man's track saw to rip equal amounts off of each edge. I've been thinking about getting a track saw to make this process a little better, but I haven't pulled the trigger yet. During the flattening process, the carbide inserts in my surfacing bit had gotten dull, and I didn't have any replacements on hand. Instead of killing another router, I decided to use my scrub plane to flatten the last face. And since this was going to be the underside of the table, I didn't care about leaving the scalloped tracks. I actually think it's kind of a cool look. Maybe I'll try it as a finished surface on another table. I headed to the jointer only to realize that these big hefty slabs are just too heavy to joint by myself. So I called in a friend, my Uncle Bo. Bo came over to help me pass them over the jointer, and it was better, but these slabs are so unwieldy, I still had to address some spots with a hand plane. After I was confident with the dry fit, Bo and I glued up the top. Tabletops are usually pretty stressful glue-ups, but this one went surprisingly well. After taking the top out of the clamps, I cut it to its final dimension of 7 feet. And I noticed a small gap near the end of the glue joint, so I filled it with glue and sawdust. I checked the rest of the joint and it seemed fine, so I'm not worried about the joint failing. Then I turned my attention to the checks in the top. I was going to stabilize them with some butterfly keys I made out of curly maple, but Jamie said she'd rather have cherry. Difference of opinion, but it's her table, so, you know. I cut out the butterflies at the benchtop bandsaw, which I like to use for small things like this. It has less grrr, a little less scary. Then I sanded off the bandsaw marks at the combo sander. To install the keys, I use double-sided carpet tape and a marking knife to mark the outline of the keys. Then I use a pencil to ride in the knife marks to help me see the line. I hog out most of the waste with a trim router and an upcut spiral bit, but not going up to my line. I found the best way to get a super tight fit is to chisel small amounts at a time, working toward your line, then finally finding that knife mark with the edge of the chisel and bringing it on home. I put a small chamfer on the bottom of the keys, add glue, then I pound them in. Once you start pounding on them, there's no turning back, so be pretty confident in your fit. I've done about a dozen of these so far, and this table has 6 total. I'm really happy with the fit, and practice makes perfect, right? I removed the bark with a draw knife, then started sanding. I started pretty aggressively with 80 grit to remove the surfacing bit marks, then went to 120 and then used some foil tape to tape over the checks and get ready for some epoxy. We decided to fill the checks to avoid food crumbs from falling in and getting stuck there. Recently, I saw a video where Martin Gobel? He advocated pouring epoxy from the bottom side up to avoid bubbles in the finished top. More on that later. I used West Systems 2-part epoxy tinted with some artist charcoal. While I respect Martin's opinion and he does some absolutely gorgeous work, I'm not a fan of the bottom side up pour. There were some low spots where the tape had dimpled and I still got a few bubbles. My preferred method is to pour from the top and use a heat gun or a torch to get rid of the bubbles. I ended up doing a couple more pours to get rid of any low spots, then chiseled and sanded everything flush. Time to apply finish. I used General Finish's Armor Seal and I started with the bottom. You always want to finish both sides of a tabletop, whether it will be seen or not. It's more about the wood reacting to seasonal changes and moving the same, so it doesn't cup or check more. I finished the bottom with 3 or 4 coats and the top with 5. On the top, I sanded in between coats with 500 grit paper and wiped it down with mineral spirits before applying the next coat. I always love that whoa moment the first time finish hits the top. Next, it was time to work on the base. I made the base out of 1.5-inch square tube steel. And I drew out a full-scale template to get some measurements instead of dusting off my trigonometry brain. I drew 2 parallel lines 28 inches apart and marked the legs with a 5-degree bias. Then I pulled a tape on all of the parts off the drawing, then headed over to my metal cutting bandsaw. I bisected the angle and cut the steel at 42.5 degrees. I want to take a moment and talk about the sponsor of this video, Grizzly Industrial. They sent me this G4030 and it's incredible. It's gear driven and 3 speeds. I forgot to order a coolant for the coolant system, so I used the slowest speed so I didn't trash the blade, and it chewed through the steel. And right now, Grizzly is offering 10% off this saw and some other tools using the code WALKER10 at checkout. I'll leave links to all the tools in the description. To get the steel ready for welding, I ground the mill scale off as well as put a slight bevel on the edges to give the weld bead a place to lay down and keep the weld strong once I ground it flush. Once I had my pieces ground, it was time to start welding. I tack welded 2 legs to the stretcher, moving around the piece to try to keep the heat down so the base didn't warp. Then I laid down full beads all the way around the joints. At the advice of some of my more proficient welding viewers, I had a fan blowing away from me to help extract some of the fumes. Once I had one of the base pieces mostly together, I got the grinder back out and ground everything flush. In the meantime, my cutting fluid came, so I added some of that to the reservoir and cut some 1/4-inch plate to make mounts for the table. I really like the idea of this kind of automated machine cutting steel while I work on grinding and getting other parts ready. Really cool machine. On the mounts, first I drilled some pilot holes, then changed out the bit to make some bigger holes. I'm making these holes bigger than the shaft of the lags I'll be using to account for seasonal movement. I welded the mounts to the top of the legs, then gave the legs a flap disc treatment. This is an 80 grit flap disc. And it takes a little finesse to get a consistent brushed look, but I really like this look. I sprayed the bases with an aerosol polyurethane to keep them from rusting, then I marked and drilled holes in the tabletop. I was almost there.
I think this would probably be the best way.
Perfect. Works for me. Oh my God, Will. Oh, you're amazing.
You want to take a look at the top side?
That's insane. How much does this thing weigh?
It's heavy.
A whole lot. Oh, it's gorgeous.
Alright guys, that's it for this one. This was a big project. It was really fun. I'm really proud of how that table turned out. I hope you guys like it too. If you're not already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. And big announcement, I have a new website up for the William Walker Company. It is www.wmwalkerco.com. Another big announcement is I have t-shirts. I have a t-shirt Teespring campaign going on right now for William Walker Company shirts. I don't have any in yet because it's a Teespring campaign, so they ship directly to you. I have 2 on order right now that haven't gotten here yet, but I'm really excited. So if you want one of those shirts, head on over to wmwalkerco.com/merch. I will also put a link in the description for one of those shirts. I will be putting links to all of the Grizzly tools that I used in this video in the description, and you can save 10% on those using code WALKER10 at checkout. And thank you again, Grizzly, for supporting my channel. Your tools are amazing, so thank you very much. Until next time, guys, I'm Will Walker. This is the William Walker Company Project channel. I'll see you guys soon. Thanks for watching.